The wheat is in the bin now. 61 bushels an acre off 1,200 acres of Texas Panhandle ground, brought in 8 days late but ahead of the first hard freeze that would have flattened the whole crop into an insurance claim instead of a harvest. The tractor that almost cost her everything sits parked at the end of the machine shed, engine idling smooth and clean, ticking over at 1,000 RPM like it never spent 3 weeks disassembled on a shop floor 40 miles from her kitchen table. A settlement check for $19,500 has already cleared her account at the co-op bank in town, the funds drawn not from her own pocket, not from a loan she couldn't have qualified for anyway, but from a bonding company that never wanted its name anywhere near a courtroom. None of that was supposed to happen. 3 months ago, the same Case IH Magnum, 6,400 hours on the clock, sat dead in her machine shed with a knock in the bottom end that told her everything she needed to know before any mechanic ever laid a wrench on it. 3 days before harvest was set to start. The dealership in town, the one with the green paint and the framed authorized dealer certificate behind the parts counter, had quoted her $22,000 for a rebuilt engine, financed if she wanted it, at terms that would have followed her for 6 years past the point she could afford to retire. She didn't have $22,000. She had a note due on the combine, a fertilizer bill from spring, and a widow's 11 years of learning exactly how far a dollar stretches when there's no one else's name on the operating loan. What she had instead was a hunch and a hauling trailer and the name of a small independent diesel shop where a woman ran the bays herself and didn't quote a number until she'd had the block open. Nobody in 3 counties knew yet what that teardown was going to turn up. Not the neighbors who shook their heads over coffee when they heard she'd passed on the dealership. Not the loan officer who'd told her, not unkindly, that used engines and hope don't show up the same on a balance sheet. Not even she herself, standing in that shop bay watching the technician run a gloved finger along a plate bolted to the engine block in a way that didn't sit quite right, that didn't match the stamping pattern of the plate 2 inches over. Underneath that plate was a second serial number. Stamped deep, stamped deliberately, stamped by someone who never expected another human being to go looking for it. That number was going to answer a question nobody in the county had thought to ask about the machine at all, not what was wrong with it, but what it actually was. That question would not get answered in that bay, on that afternoon, in the shape anyone standing there could have predicted. It would take weeks. It would take a retired title clerk squinting at microfiche in a county courthouse basement, and a stack of bonding paperwork nobody had touched in 9 years. But the ending of it, the part worth knowing before the rest unspools, sits in a wheat field a little over a month later, dust hanging gold in the late afternoon light, a combine working a header through standing grain that by all rights should have already been in the bin. She stands at the edge of that field now, watching the grain tank fill, watching the auger swing out to unload into a waiting truck bed, and the number coming back off the yield monitor reads 61 bushels an acre. 1,200 acres of it, harvest running 8 days behind where she'd planned, but ahead of the first hard freeze that had been sitting on the forecast like a debt come due. 11 years she had run this ground by herself, since the year her husband died and left her the deed, the equipment, and every decision that came after. 11 years of learning what a balance sheet could and couldn't forgive, what a banker meant when he said something wasn't unkind, but wasn't yes either. What it cost in sweat and interest to keep 1,200 acres of Panhandle wheat ground turning over season after season, with one tractor standing between her and total loss. That tractor is out there now, running clean, pulling a load it was never supposed to pull again, according to the dealership that quoted her $22,000 to fix it, and the loan officer who told her that number wasn't happening on his desk. It runs on an engine that didn't exist in that block 8 weeks ago, a rebuild nobody in 3 counties could have priced out the way it eventually got priced, paid for with money that came from a place nobody expected, traced back to a serial number nobody was supposed to find. She'll tell you, if you ask her over coffee at the co-op, that none of it felt like triumph while it was happening. It felt like arithmetic that refused to balance, like waiting on people who owed her nothing to decide whether they owed her something after all. But standing at the edge of that field, watching the yield monitor climb past 60, watching grain the color of old rope pour into a truck bed under a sky that hadn't frozen yet, it is hard for her not to feel like something got settled that was bigger than one harvest. To understand how she got there, you have to go back 3 days before this same harvest was ever supposed to start. To a cold morning, a key that wouldn't turn into anything but silence, and a tractor that had, without her knowing it, been lying to her for 9 years. The morning it happened, the sky over the Panhandle was the flat white color it gets before a hard blue day, and the wheat stood at 14% moisture, right where she wanted it, right where 11 years of watching moisture meters had taught her it needed to be before a combine ever touched it. She was running the Case IH Magnum in low gear along the header of the North 80, pulling a grain cart she'd have needed running in 3 more days, when the engine let out a knock she felt in her sternum before she heard it in her ears. It was not a sound she'd heard from that tractor in 9 years of ownership and 6,400 hours of recorded use, logged in a spiral notebook she kept in the glove box the way her husband had taught her, oil changes and filter swaps, and hours written down in a hand that had gotten steadier over the years, not shakier. The engine died in the field with a shudder that rattled the cab glass, already cracked in one corner from a hailstorm 2 summers back. And then there was nothing, no turnover, no catch, just the wind moving through wheat that was ready to cut, and a silence where 6,400 hours of engine noise should have been. She sat in the cab for a long moment before she climbed down, because she already knew, in the part of her that had spent 11 years running 1,200 acres by herself, exactly what a knock like that meant, and exactly what it was going to cost her. The tractor was the only one on the operation. There was no second machine to lean on, no neighbor's spare Magnum sitting idle who'd loan it out for the week, not this deep into a harvest window that narrows by the hour once the grain starts standing hard and dry and vulnerable to shatter loss, to hail, to the first real wind that could put half a year's income flat on the ground. She had 3 days before the earliest safe start, maybe 5 before the moisture crept low enough to start costing her bushels, and she had a tractor with a rod knocked deep enough that she didn't need a mechanic to tell her the block was likely compromised. What she had, financially, was thinner than the moisture window. The farm ran close to the bone most years, closer since input costs had climbed the way they had, and there was no equipment loan sitting unused, no operating line with enough headroom to absorb a 5-figure repair without consequence. She had savings meant for spring seed and fall land payments, and she had whatever equity a woman alone could squeeze out of a bank that had never quite known what to do with her file. She climbed down off the tractor, stood in wheat up past her knees, and did the arithmetic in her head the way she always did, hours, dollars, days, and none of it balanced. Not yet. The call to the dealership went the way she suspected it would before she ever dialed, but she made it anyway, because a farmer who skips steps is a farmer who gets blamed later for skipping steps. The service manager she reached had a voice she recognized from a decade of parts orders and oil filter runs, pleasant enough on the surface, the kind of pleasant that came preloaded with an answer before she'd finished the question. $22,000, he told her, for a factory rebuilt long block, genuine Case IH components, full warranty, and that was before labor, before the gasket set, before the coolant, and the diagnostic hours they'd already logged pulling the pan. 2 weeks minimum on parts availability, maybe longer if the regional warehouse was tight, which it usually was in July, when every Magnum and every Steiger in 3 states was breaking down at once, under the same brutal load. She asked, carefully, what a payment arrangement might look like, whether there was any program, any dealer financing that didn't require 6 months of bank statements she didn't have time to assemble. He laughed, not unkindly, but not kindly either. A laugh that had heard the question 100 times from operations smaller than hers and had learned to treat it as something between a formality and a courtesy. He said something about equipment loans needing approval cycles measured in weeks, not days, about harvest timing being unfortunate, but not something the dealership could bend around, and underneath the professional gloss, she heard the thing she'd heard from that particular counter before, that a widow running 1,200 acres alone was, in the arithmetic of his branch's risk tolerance, a marginal file, patient with her but not for her. By the time she hung up, the number had already started traveling, the way numbers do in a county where everyone's radio is tuned to the same 2 stations and everyone's coffee is poured at the same 3 tables. $22,000 became the kind of figure men repeated to each other with a shake of the head, sympathetic and final, as if the number itself settled the matter. And when word got around, because word always got around, that she was thinking about hauling the tractor 40 miles to some independent outfit instead of waiting on the dealership's rebuilt long block, the sympathy curdled into something closer to warning. A green machine belonged in a green shop, was the unspoken rule nobody had ever needed to say aloud until she threatened to break it, and breaking it looked to some of them less like resourcefulness than like a woman making a bad situation worse out of stubbornness, or ignorance, or both. She heard the edges of it secondhand, the way she always did, and she stood in her kitchen that evening with the phone still warm in her hand, looking at a wheat field she couldn't afford to lose and a repair bill she couldn't afford to pay, and she started making calls of her own kind, the kind nobody at the co-op counter would think to make first. The first call went to a parts distributor out of Amarillo who owed her nothing but the truth, and the truth he gave her was that a long block from Case IH Corporate would take 11 to 14 days minimum even if she paid the full $22,000 today. Cash, no financing delay, because the rebuilt units were back-ordered same as everything else that summer. 14 days put her wheat past the point of no return. She had watched a neighbor lose a crop to shatter loss, 2 years running, for less delay than that. Watched the heads go from gold to brittle to empty in the space of a bad week. And she was not going to stand in a field in September counting kernels on the ground like rain that already fell. The second call went to a woman she'd met exactly once, 3 years back, at a Panhandle custom harvesters meeting in Pampa, where she'd shared a folding table with a diesel mechanic who ran her own two-bay shop 40 miles east, and talked about injector timing the way some women talked about canning recipes, with a specificity that told you she'd done it herself, more than once, and hadn't needed anyone's permission to learn it. She didn't call the shop a rebuild house. She called it what it was to her that night, a chance. The woman on the other end of the line didn't promise a discount and didn't promise a miracle. She asked for the engine hours, the model number, whether the coolant had shown any milkshake color in the dipstick, whether it had died running or died sitting, and she listened to the answers the way the dealership never had, writing them down instead of reciting a price. She said, "Bring it Tuesday." She said she couldn't promise the number would be lower than 22,000 until she had the pan off and the block in front of her, but she said it like a woman who intended to look, not like a woman reading from a script taped to a service counter. That was enough. It wasn't a guarantee, but 11 years of running the operation alone had taught her that guarantees mostly came from people who'd never had to keep one. She hung up the phone, poured the last of the coffee down the sink, and went out to back the flatbed trailer up to the shed in the dark, feeling for the hitch by memory the way her husband used to before her, headlights cutting a short tunnel through the dust toward a decision that would look, by morning light at the co-op counter, like the kind of thing a woman did when she'd stopped listening to good advice, and like the only thing left to do from where she was standing. Tuesday came in gray and windless, the kind of stillness that felt borrowed against the harvest calendar rather than given freely. She was at the shop by 7, with the tractor still chained to the flatbed, and the technician was already in coveralls, sleeves pushed up, a compression tester laid out on a rolling cart like surgical instruments arranged before the first cut. There was no small talk about weather or wheat prices, no circling. The technician asked her to sit where she could see the gauge, not out in the waiting room with a coffee and a magazine, and that alone told her something about the kind of shop she'd landed in. They ran compression on all 6 cylinders before anything else came apart, the technician calling numbers out loud: 380, 375, 210, 190, 205, 60, and letting the farmer write them down herself in the same notebook she'd used for 11 years of oil changes and fuel receipts. The technician didn't soften the 6th number or rush past it. She tapped the gauge twice, checked the fitting, ran it again, and got the same low reading, which meant it wasn't the tester lying. That cylinder was dead weight, dragging compression from its neighbors, explaining the knock that had put the tractor down in the first place. The pan came off next, then the oil pump, the technician's hands moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who trusted her own eyes over a parts catalog. She had the farmer feel the rod bearings herself, not just look, feel, running a thumbnail across metal that should have been smooth and finding instead a fine, gritty roughness that had no business being there at 6,400 hours on a properly maintained Magnum. The technician explained, bearing wear the way she'd have explained it to another mechanic, not a customer, material transfer, oil starvation patterns, the difference between normal wear and something that had been run hard once and covered up since. The farmer nodded along, asking the kind of questions that made the technician glance up at her once, something like respect crossing her face before she went back to the block. By mid-morning the head was off, set aside on a clean pad of cardboard, and the technician was working her way down toward the main bearing caps, torque wrench and breaker bar laid out in order like a checklist nobody needed to read aloud. The shop smelled of diesel and cutting oil, and the particular metallic sweetness of an engine finally forced to confess what had been wrong with it. Nothing yet pointed to anything beyond ordinary hard use and a rod bearing that had given up its fight, and the farmer let herself breathe a little easier at that, doing the arithmetic in her head against $22,000. Then the technician reached the block itself.